and welcome to another Scots Whay podcast. In this podcast, I spoke to writer, poet, and now musician Andrew Greig, and I have to say it was one of the most enjoyable chats we've had in some time. Andrew spoke initially about Clean by Rain, his spoken word and music CD that he's made with the musician Brian Michie, and he talks a little bit about the ideas behind that, about how the collaboration worked. It's quite unusual actually, and how Brian's music and his words just seem to fit together almost organically, and you'll hear more about that in a minute. And he also talks about his poetry and his prose as well, particularly one of my favourite novels of his, which is Fair Helen, based on a border ballad, 16th century historical novel. It's a terrific read. We also get a little bit of music related to that, which is a real treat. And behind all of this is this fantastic story which unfolds about how Andrew had originally started wanting to make music and with friends of his, and as years have gone by and people have been lost and then reconnected, he is going to be able to do just that. It's a lovely story. Anyway, enough from me. I will see you on the other side of this. Hello everyone, and welcome to another Scots Whay podcast. And today I'm joined by writer and musician Andrew Greig. Hello Andrew.
Hi, Alistair.
Now I said musician that way because we're going to talk initially about Clean by Rain, your spoken word and music CD, which is out now.
It's my first one. I'm very excited about it.
Well, you have obviously do the spoken word on it, and the music is done by Brian Michie. Is that correct? Would you describe yourself now as a musician to add to writer and poet?
Well, I've always been a frustrated, failed musician. Basically, I'm a writer because I didn't quite have the ability and the absolute determination to make a living from music. That's what I wanted to be when I was 15 to 20.
Yeah, sure.
That was it. I was so turned on by the music of the time, which was extraordinary, but in particular Dylan and the string band. And because the string band were from Edinburgh, that made a huge difference because I was an Anstoler and I thought you could be cutting edge and Scottish. I think it was like what the novelists were 10 years after me. It was what Jim Kelman's Lanark did for them. You could be Scottish and cutting edge, because at age 17 I was pretty embarrassed about being Scottish. It was a fact, but it wasn't something I was that keen on. I was much more interested in being Californian or from Liverpool, or was part of that international thing of what was happening. And Scottish mostly seemed like the White Heather Club to me.
I was exactly the same. You can't kind of cringe off the culture.
There was a bit of a cringe, and then when I heard the incredible string band, I thought this is absolutely amazing. It wasn't just me. Obviously a lot of my heroes thought this was the business too, and I think that's what really kind of gave us permission. We thought we could do that, possibly not as well, but we could write songs and we can do stuff in a fairly chaotic manner. And that was, once I got the guitar, that was my principal interest, and the poetry really was started off as a sideline.
Right.
There were kind of songs, and there were lyrics for songs that either never made it or never got finished or just weren't good enough. And that's what I did. I wrote about it in this book, the book with Mike Heron, You Know What You Could Be. Mm-hmm. That process whereby you're all aspiration, unlimited ability and very, very little experience, but your desire is so strong to become this thing and find this world that you know it's not the one that you're surrounded by, but it's just like next door. Yeah. And if you try hard enough, you believe you can actually get there. So what happened was that I started writing poems almost on the side, as well as we were recording songs on our terrible 2-track Grundig tape recorder, and we got in touch with a string band, met them, started sending the tapes to Joe Boyd. That was our thing for a long time. We made tapes of 4 albums.
Right.
With the photos and miniature little cutouts and everything like that. My friend George Boyter, who was the other half of Fate and Ferret, had a real arty ability. And so we used to make up these. We made the world's first triple album before George Harrison.
Right.
And it's beautiful. It's like about 4 inches by 4 inches.
Yeah.
And some of the title tracks were a bit notional, they were just titles or the first few lines that we had. Some of them were recorded. Anyway, what I do remember had a big effect on me was in my last year at school, I was sending out poems to places, Scotsman in particular. I wanted to have a poem in the Weekend Scotsman because I'd seen poems in the Weekend Scotsman,
yeah.
in particular Norman McCaig's and Ian Crichton Smith. And Robert Nye, who's the poetry editor, eventually accepted one, and I think it was £2 for that. Encouraged by this, I sent some more poems to George Bruce at BBC Radio. They paid me 5 guineas. The guineas I thought was great, really classy guineas. And it was quite a bit of money in 1969.
Right.
And I just started to see the light that, hang on, I've been knocking on the door of this music thing for 2 years or so. Mm-hmm. And though Joe Boyd was very sweet and kind of encouraging, it was so manifestly obvious we were a long, long way from making an album. And George was going off to art college, so we couldn't really go on the road and we couldn't move to London. But the BBC were prepared to pay me 5 guineas for poems. Mm-hmm. So I gradually got the message.
Yeah.
But a lot of this CD, the first ideas for that, I think, came way early in my first year at the university. There was a thing called Poetry Roadshow.
Right.
That I was in with my friends Ron Butler and Brian McCabe and Liz Lochhead. Mm-hmm. And I was playing some music, and we had 2 better young musicians who were playing with us. And so we were doing this poetry and music. It was a lot in the air. The Liverpool scene were doing poetry and music, picking up of the jazz and poetry thing from the 50s. I don't think we ever got very good at it, but it really did. It gave me a yen to do more of it, because I could see that though I couldn't really sing, I could find a way of delivering the poems with music behind it. Sometimes just with rhythm, just sometimes a bass, sometimes mood music, all kinds of stuff. So I think it goes back to the Poetry Roadshow, wanting to do this thing. And more or less, over the next 40 years, 35 of them anyway, I really downgraded music.
Yeah.
I mean, I love it. I love playing guitar and lastly the banjo. It's a huge part of my life. It's far more fun than writing.
Yeah.
It just is. The other great thing is if you write a song, or take someone else's song, you can play it 100 times. I don't sit and read my own poems at night for entertainment.
Yes,
that would be
of course.
ridiculous. That would be bizarre. But I'm happy to sing my own songs or other people's songs 100 times because they come out differently. Mm-hmm. There's an emotional dynamic. There's a physical dynamic about singing and playing. So what happened was I gradually, as I got old, somewhere in my 50s, acquired the brass neck to start very occasionally doing a song in public. Mm-hmm. Because I had an audience for the poetry in particular, and the doors were locked, and I thought, well, people are too polite to leave, and I thought, okay, I'm just going to try doing this. So I'd start doing a song or two or more, particularly once I got the banjo, and I discovered I enjoyed it. It let me relax. It gave an audience a chance to relax, because listening to poetry it's hard work. It's very intense listening, and music songs are much more relaxed thing. It kind of goes over you and through you.
Yeah.
And so just from the point of view of performance, it worked. And so gradually I realised, in fact the last 5 years, let's say, if I do a reading, even of prose books, I tend to do it either with other musicians or just by myself. And music was becoming definitely part of what I did. I realised that I had a repertoire, and in private, I would never do my own stuff. I'd always just, I love singing in sessions and I know an awful lot of songs. I'm not that good a guitarist, I'm not a great singer, but I know an awful lot of songs. I'm no guy that remembers the words.
Yeah.
A lot of people launch off brilliantly, and after 2.5 verses, Nobody knows the words. I know all the words for Desolation Row and these great long things. I know the Cohen songs. I know all that core repertoire and Americana and stuff, and increasingly sort of 40s and 50s jazzy things and blues things. So, point is that I was ready, I think, to start thinking about making a CD, and I decided in the first instance not to do one of my own songs. So I'd like to, and I think that's probably the next project. But what happened was, because I was doing this book with Mike Heron, the You Know What You Could Be thing, and this was all about the latter 60s in Wade Academy Anstruther and our band Fate and Ferret, the kind of string band light. But we had a guy who was in the class below us at school whose name is Brian Michie, but we called him Eric Plectrum just because of Eric Clapton, and he was an electric guitarist and he was really good, and he was real rock and roll.
Yeah.
I mean, he was hard case, he drank, he smoked, he shouted at people, he led the life. He looked great in Levi's and he had a leather waistcoat, and he was just instinctively, naturally rock and roll.
Yeah.
In the way that we were a couple of scruffy kids, and it just wasn't. We didn't have that attitude.
Yeah.
And he did. Anyway, Brian was a real pal, and he played on quite a lot of the tracks on the albums that never got made. And we lost sight of each other, the way you do, after he left school and we left school. And because of the book, I found him after 45, 48 years, because no one knew if he was even alive. You know, he'd gone to Glasgow and disappeared. He could have been anyway. Given his rock and roll lifestyle, we feared he could well be dead. And then, due to the miracle of Facebook, which his daughter had put him on just a few weeks earlier, because he doesn't do that stuff. He can't do it. It's just not his thing. He's a real technophobe. But his daughter persuaded him that she wanted to put up at least a website with a name in it, and we found him there. And I emailed him and said, "Are you the Eric Plectrum, Brian Michie?" And so we met, and it was wonderful, very emotional.
Fantastic.
And it turned out that he had the life more or less that he wanted. He'd worked with the Citizens Theatre quite a lot, from everything from being a carpenter to doing backing music to providing soundtracks, and playing in a band called Savard,
right,
which is where the Savard Studios. It was an old mate of Brian Young's,
right,
which is where this CD was engineered. So these are all about these connections, the way the kind of life kind of catches up with you catch up with it. Brian and I were chatting. It turned out he had about 200 short instrumental pieces, mostly done on a keyboard, about 8 years ago, I think. But he was playing everything himself with a bit of live guitar and bass put over it. And they're all about between 2.5 and 4 minutes long. Right. And he said, "You ever thought about combining something like that with the poems?" Because he knew Moran. Right. And he thought, okay, we'll give that a try. And I think that is what's odd about this CD. Because usually if you put poetry and music together, either the music is written to go with the poems, or the poems are written to go with the music. Yeah. In this case, the poems already existed and the music already existed. So these were two givens. Right. So what we did was we listened to, not all of the 200, that's an awful lot of music, maybe 50. And out of that, we got a short list of about 15, 20 pieces. And I thought these could work with poems. And we read separately through the sort of dozen or so poems I'd selected down to, I wanted to try, that I knew worked from my poetry readings. And the weird thing was, with only one exception, we had drawn up the same list of pairings. Right. That bit of music is going to go with the poem called Orkney. That one is Shetland. The one called Scotland is definitely that. It was really surprising.
It's really interesting to hear that, because having listened to the CD a few times now, I would never have said that these weren't completely collaborated together from the beginning, because the music really fits. Not just the rhyme or the rhythm of the words, but the sentiment behind it. You know, the tone, exactly.
Yeah. It was quite surprising, because I thought we might have had completely different ideas, but there must have been something instinctively right about it. So, and I think of it as felting, because usually, see, the music's a background for the poems, or it's a mood setting. But in this case, it isn't, and I didn't want it to be. So I didn't want either to crowd the other out. So I want you to be able to hear and follow the music all the time, even once the voice comes in, rather than fading it down, which is the instinctive thing to do, put it into the background. So it's more like a song in that sense, that the vocals and the music are kind of on equal terms with each other. And so when we went into the Savage Studios to do this with Brian Young, he really got that, and because he's used to recording bands and music, that's what he does.
Course, yeah.
He's really good at it. So that was that idea, I think, and that we all three of us agreed on, and that's what makes it unusual as a poetry and music thing, because I say the vocal, the words, the verbals, I call them, aren't put right in the front. They're in with everything else, and it never, I hope, makes the music disappear.
No, not
because
at all.
it's just to be there. And some of it, Brian suggested, was a little bit inert, just because it came from a different musical period. This was done on analogue, a very good analogue machine. Everything had to be transferred to digital. And Brian's a really good musician. Both Brians are really good musicians. So anyway, they said, we need something live on top of this.
Okay.
So we got this chap, Alan Tall, who's an old mucker of both Brians. And bizarrely, I had met Alan Tall one night in Drury Lane Arts Lab in 1969, after George and I, as Fate and Ferret, had gone to hear the extended version of Magical Mystery Tour. Right. And we were just thinking, where are we going to sleep tonight? And this guy with really, really, really long hair, very, very thin, comes up and says, "Hey man, you're Scottish?" And we said, "Yes, we are." He said, "I'm from Glasgow, name's Alan J. Toll. You got any about a crash, man?" And we said, "No, man." So he put me, and he was staying temporarily in London in a flat somewhere. And we slept on the floor, and I'd always remembered him, and I'd written about him. Right. That act of kindness. There was nothing in the flat, apart from guitar and porridge oats and Tate and Lyle golden syrup. That was it. There wasn't even milk. Yeah. So he gave us everything he had. He made us porridge with golden syrup in it, and then we slept. And the next morning we had more porridge and golden syrup. And as we were about to head off back for the fish lorry back to Scotland, he said, "I'm going back to Glasgow. If you ever want to look me up, I'm the only Alan J. Toll in the Glasgow phone book." Right. And it's not a name you forget.
No, it's not. J that did. Yeah, absolutely.
Alan Toll I could have forgotten. But about 30-something years later, I was mentioning a story to my friend George, and he said, "Oh yeah, I remember him. Wasn't that lovely? I wonder if we can get hold of him." So I eventually got round. I went on the net and Googled, and I found an Alan Toll without the J, so I wasn't sure if it was him on the net. And this guy was a musician and actor. That's what he'd done all his life. But I couldn't recognise him because the photograph, he's got virtually no hair.
Yeah, sure.
He's 50-odd years older. But there was one photo in his photo library of this skinny hippie playing sitar in a back garden with a very bad colour photograph, and it had all been warped with time. Sure. I thought, that's him. That's definitely him. So I had an email address, so I emailed him and said, "You probably won't remember me, but you once put us up for a night when we were completely scunnered in London." And he got back. I mean, life is amazing. He said, "I've never forgotten you guys, but I didn't know what your names were. All I knew was you were Fate and Ferret, and you were from Pitt and Weem." Yeah. He said, "I didn't know you were Andrew Greig." He said, "I've been reading your books for years. I had no idea that was you."
Incredible, isn't it? Quite incredible.
It was so sweet. So we had to get him on the CD. So Alan plays flute, sort of played live over the mixed recording on 3 of the tracks, and I think he really lifts it. I love his flute plays. Very good guitarist too. But as the flute playing was refreshed.
I agree. The flute is when I was listening to it before I came through again today, that was what really hit me as being, it just enlivens it. It just brings a kind of, as you say, a freshness to it. Yeah. So when Brian had all this music, did he plans to do anything with it, or was he just in a form of storing up?
I think he never felt he was much good at lyrics. I think he had a notion that, because the structured like songs, if you listen closely, there's mostly a first verse in effect, and then it's done again but a bit differently, and then there's a middle section, and then it returns to... They're nearly all structured,
right,
which is the classic way of
structuring
structuring songs, as opposed to being kind of abstract musical pieces. So I think in the back of his mind he must have been looking for somebody to write the words for it, but to be sung.
But what's interesting is your lyrics aren't really like songs. They are spoken. No, so I noticed that the music was structured that way. I'll have to listen again to see that. But because the lyrics aren't structured that way, for want of a better word, that's a really interesting way of doing it. You know, like the music's trying to go in one way, and
that's it exactly. Because they are going. They're not marching in step.
Yeah.
I mean, I do write songs, and I write songs fairly conventionally, A, B, B, or A, B if I'm being far out. And I do have, two verses, middle section, chorus, whatever. For some reason, I'm fairly conventional when I write songs. But these poems, they don't have regular meters, they don't have regular rhymes, so they cannot be sung.
Yeah.
Really. They'd be very, very hard to make that work as sung things, so they don't have the clear patterning. I mean, they've got a lot of tone and rhythms and internal rhyme and off rhyme and stuff. But, I mean, I always think that a poem is like a song that happens to not have a tune. But the difference in some ways is even greater than that it's it doesn't have the same structural devices.
Right. That's right.
Even someone like Dylan, take like a Rolling Stone. It's an utterly revolutionary song, but it's really quite conventional in structure.
Absolutely.
It has verses, all of which are the same length, which rhyme in fairly conventional ways. I mean, there's multiple rhymes, which he was really good at, but it's recognisably a song. Yeah.
Well, it's like you were saying about with poetry, you have to pay attention, you have to concentrate, whereas with music, it's a different relationship with music, it's a more a two-way kind of relationship in a way, and you let it come to you. And I'm thinking about you saying you knew all the lyrics, but with something like a Rolling Stone, there will be people who just know the chorus, and they'll be kind of and then they'll go, how does it? And that's when they'll remember what it is, because they've listened to it, perhaps not as... they haven't maybe read through the liner notes and put the lyrics to memory, but they still love the song because of that. Whereas with the lyrics on Clean by Rain and with poetry in general, to get what's being said, you really have to concentrate on it and, to get the meanings behind it.
I think that's why it's harder work listening, in a way. The listener has to really get the words. Because they're not being sung, I suppose, and so you tend to have a denser verbal component as well.
Yeah.
So what we actually did was, once we'd agreed on which pieces we're going to use musically, that I did my homework and then went into the studio and basically put the piece on the headphones, and I'd already worked out where I was going to come in and drop out, and you have quite long pauses, so it wasn't like right through as you know, there's quite pauses between 10 seconds and 30, or even a minute once or twice, where the music just does its thing.
Yeah.
And so I was so it's live, in a sense it's a live recording, but something that's already been written beforehand, with music that cannot be changed. I mean, it couldn't be changed apart from refreshing it with the flutes. So it was a really odd and rather exciting experience.
Well, when I first listened to it, it felt like it had been recorded live, perhaps, like it was a performance. The whole thing was a performance piece, because you say the music's given the space to breathe as well, and and build an atmosphere, and then the lyrics kind of add to that atmosphere. Let's talk a little bit about the words themselves. What I thought it was like almost like a travelogue or stroke comment on the nation, as someone was travelling around different parts of the country. It's probably a bit simplistic. Movements, yes, absolutely. So was that what you were trying to get over? What was the reason behind?
No, I think it was just the thematic things just emerged.
Right.
I just chose because I liked them, and then the poems and the ones I'd already read quite a lot when I was doing live readings, and so I basically just took a handful of them, the ones that went with the music that was on offer. And I think this is what often happens, the sort of thematic unity, if there is one, or diversity, emerges by some kind of unconscious process. So by halfway through, we were aware that, there's a track called Orkney,
Yeah.
because there's a poem called Orkney, a track called Shetland, the one something called Scotland, and there's just a lot of movement, there's a lot of the geography of our country in it. And Scotland has always been the principal subject, I suppose, of my novels and poetry. So it's not so surprising that is in it.
But there's also individual stories being told in these places.
Yes, there's love stories, of course, and relationship stories, and stories of events and people. I'd have to look at the tracks just to see what's actually on this, just to remind myself. Yeah, Knoydart Revisited, I'd forgotten that one. I used to do a lot of Munros, and because I used to do proper mountaineering in the Himalayas and stuff like that. And then when I got past it, frankly, I just confined myself to doing Scottish hills. And so I had this poem kicking around, Knoydart Revisited, which is, it's a love story, but it's also about the hills in Knoydart. And it was when I was doing that one, I thought, there's something I'm addressing here, and I don't quite know what it is, but here all these tracks are about this different variations or versions of the same things, about feeling alive in particular places in a particular country that I know pretty well.
And I think that's, again, where the music works really well with them, because the music has, I won't use the term ambient, but there is, it's not confined, it stretches, it changes, but it's always seems to be part of the whole thing, and I think the lyrics work like that as well. Well, yes, they work as individual tracks, and I think you can do that, but the whole thing just feels complete.
It's spacey.
It is spacey.
There's a lot of space in Brian's music, so it really suits the outdoor poems like Orkney, Shetland, with a little bit of subtle echo that Brian Young added. It kind of brings that out. So there is a kind of breathing space quality that I really like. And there's a couple of quite heavy tracks. The one called Hoof that I already had, which was about rock and roll overload in Anstruther Town Hall in 1965, which Brian knew really well as well. He knew those violent beat concerts that we used to go to. And luckily he had a couple of heavier tracks. Yeah. Because as far as I remember, there's no drums in this thing. I mean, that's what's...
I think you're right.
It's very rhythmic.
That track in particular is heavy, and it's got the guitar, and it's got the... But, it's still not a conventional rock and roll.
It's not rock and roll, because there's about 3 different basses, but they're all done on keyboard. And above all, there's not drums. There's an electric guitar, which is great, and essentially it's Crossroads. Brian would admit that. That's what's lurking in behind it. That's what it is. And it disintegrates into chaos at the end, which is exactly what my poem did. I thought, we've really got to do this together. And that was when I got one of the biggest kicks out of. So, but that in a way is untypical, because that feels like something that happens in a compressed space, in a compressed town hall inside your head. Whereas a lot of the other ones are pretty outdoorsy and outside.
I just took it as a different aspect of the country. So you've got the outdoors aspect and the epic aspect, but then you've also got the little things which are going in town halls or in church halls or where there's this kind of internal drama going on.
Yes, and bedrooms. Let's be frank.
Yeah.
I was just thinking that because it starts, and we always knew this was going to be the first track poem, which I already had, called "A Man Is Driving," and we recorded it first because I was confident about it, and I knew, and it just starts, a man is driving along a road that ends, sure as fate and chance conspire, in a precipice. That's life. And I remember with the headphones on saying that along with Brian's music, and I thought, this is fun. This can work.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great opening, and
it establishes that sense of movement. Absolutely. That's the first thing that comes in. A man is driving along a road that ends. So it's always about mortality in London and Scotland. And I think when we came to track ordering, having realised that was an opening track, we did think of it because in the old days of LPs, sequencing, ordering was really, really important.
Of course, yeah.
And we had a lot of fun trying to work out the best kind of order to make it some kind of a journey through it.
And it feels like an album. That's what I mean. Like an
Yes,
old
it
album.
does.
Feel like, you know, you could turn it over halfway through and continue the journey on the B side.
That's right, and of course it ends with a short track called "Signing Off." That's me off. Then you should not be surprised. Departure has long been my nature and theme, and that's the kind of little kind of jokes that people used to do with LPs. You know, the first track, the last track on the first side, the first track on the second side, and the very last track. These are all really crucial. You knew they were going to be something you needed to pay attention to. And then I thought, I want to put a bonus track in. Because I love the implied generosity of the phrase bonus track. So there's 2 bonus tracks, and it gave me a chance to use something live I did a gig in the Queen's Hall about a couple of years earlier, which had really, really good sound quality. The sound engineer there is terrific, and they gave me permission to use it. So one is an actual song. It's the only time I actually allow myself to sing. But I'm with 2 proper musicians. This collaborative thing, I think, is important, as well as Brian and Alan Toll. They had Fiona Hunter and Mike Vass, a wonderful player. They're both really fine musicians. They're proper musicians. They're not really, but they lift you up and they coddle you and they're going to carry you in a net. So I did a song of mine about my dear friend Mal Duff, who died in the Himalayas. He was the guy that got me into the Himalayan climbing. And then we did a thing called Found at Sea, which is a kind of sailing micro-epic. Again, it's in Scapa flow, it's very specific, it's very Scottish, and it's got movement. And I knew that's where I wanted to end the thing, with this micro-epic sea voyage. And they played in a more conventional way in behind it. The music there is entirely to add mood and add dynamics and move it along. It's not actually made specifically to be listened to in the way that Brian's was.
Right.
So in a way, these bonus tracks are very different, partly because they're live and they got that acoustic you get with live music, and also the relationship of music to verbals is more what you'd expect it to be, which is all right.
Yeah.
But it kind of rounded off the journey as well as being a kind of PS.
Yes, absolutely. So when you're writing, say, a collection of poetry, do you think about that in a similar way, that you're putting together a collection which is a whole and not just individual poems? Or,
yeah, very much. I think again that's because of this background in music, in LPs. I'd always thought of a poetry collection not as just a bunch of poems. I was always really interested in ordering them and sequencing and picking ones that sat with each other.
Yeah.
And so you'd get change, contrast, development, and quite a lot of about 3 or 4 of my books of poetry, things like Men and Ice and Western Swing and Found at Sea, they're all narratives. There's a real and implied narrative movement through it. The ones that are not narratives still have a kind of emotional fluxes and changes of place and changes of imagery. So yes, I'd always thought of them as something that is partly to be enjoyed and taken in as a whole. It's not how they're written, as a rule, unless I was writing something which I knew was a narrative poem in many parts. It's more a matter of doing it and then seeing the patterns that emerge and basically the best order of presenting them.
Yeah. And the patterns tend to emerge as you're writing at a time, or can you say, I wrote something, a few years ago which would be perfect now to fit in with these? I mean, how does that...
Well, as a rule, what happens is that I've got the poems, it's a collection's worth, let's say. And sometimes I just literally lay them out on the floor and you just look and scan and feel the ones that live with each other, and one or two that actually really, I'll keep that for another collection. That just doesn't fit here.
Yeah.
It won't work. And you always try to get the first one and the last one, and then the odd big thing that you can put somewhere in the middle, and see the shape of it. I mean, very occasionally, when you're writing a long poem in many parts, let's say, like Found at Sea, you do occasionally have to write something because it's necessary to write something that's going to go in there and do this thing.
Yeah. So there's you've got a central theme.
Yeah, sometimes you have to fill in the blanks.
Yes.
And that's quite a conscious thing. But as a rule, what happens with me at least is that one poem will set off another one, which sets off another in a kind of sprouting kind of progress, which I'm never really in control of, but I'm very happy when it happens.
It sounds quite similar to how you would maybe write an album.
I think it probably is. I think it just kind of grows, and every so often there's a poem or two just get lost and forgotten, and then you might come across it a few years later and think, oh, I could use that now. I could stick that in this collection I'm doing now.
You spoke how writing songs is different to when you write poetry, because you said you're more structured, maybe not more structured, but you're more conventional in the music than the poetry. How then is the change between writing in those ways to then writing fiction?
Well, writing prose,
Writing prose.
all in all, is basically, I never had any ambition to be a prose writer or a novelist. It wasn't one of my notions. It wasn't how I saw myself, if I saw myself at all. It was really a wannabe musician who gradually got published as a poem, so somebody eventually does a book of poetry, and then you said anything, well, I guess that's what I do. And it was better than having a job, so I stuck with it. But for about 10 years, that's all I did was publish poetry, which meant I was properly poor and dependent on the Scottish Arts Council and, doing bar jobs and stuff and signing on, because in those days they didn't hassle you that much when you were signing on. And what happened was I got into prose genuinely by accident, because I was offered by mistake a chance to go on his Himalayan climbing expedition, the Mustag Tower, in the Karakoram with Maldub, because he'd read Men Are Nice, which was one of my long narrative poems about 4 people trying to climbing some kind of mountain. Basically, it was about getting high because it was the 70s. But the imagery was mountaineering. So I was very interested in Dougal Aston and Borrington and Doug Scott climbing, trying to put up a new route on Everest at the time. But I'd never climbed anything. So Mal said, hey, do you want to come to Mustag Tower with us? And he seemed like I could do what I'd written about. He knew the book.
Yeah.
And so it was one of those actions. He'd read the book. It had really good reviews in the climbing press. And he didn't get that poetry is essentially metaphorical. He really thought that. No, it's true.
No, I can imagine.
We both
so good.
cut in a pub in South Queensferry. And so I said, yeah, sure, man, why not? And then we shook hands and wheeled off separate directions into the night. And then he walked into my door about a week later and said, stay there if you want it. And I said, what? Mustang Tower, man. Talked to our sponsor, Rocky Moss was his name. American millionaire called Rocky Moss.
Fantastic.
It's fabulous. And Rocky really wants you to go, but the thing is you have to write a book about it. And I said, look, I can't climb and I'm scared of heights. Genuinely, I've always been scared of heights. I love hills. He said, oh, right. In that case, well, you're not going to the top. It's a very serious hill. It's 24,000 feet and it's only been climbed once. It's pretty impregnable. But all you have to do is go to the col at 21,000 feet and I'll train you up starting now. And we've got 6 months.
Wow.
Do you want to do it? And he said you've got a week to make up your mind. So I did do it in the end. After hesitation, because I'm not
sure.
at all a brave person, and I'd say I don't like heights. So we trained in Glencoe mostly, but some in the Cairngorms through one long winter. Anyway, the point is that I wrote a book about it, and I discovered I really liked writing prose because you can do it every day. It satisfies a kind of latent work ethic I must have. Poetry just it's there or it's not there, and for months you feel fraudulent, you're not writing anything. And you can try and write in that mood and it's awful, it's horrible, it's embarrassing. Whereas to some extent, prose is manufactured.
Yeah.
And there's a different idea, you're trying to, to some extent what the story is, particularly if it's a non-fiction book. And you're trying to put those pictures and stories in the head of the reader. It's more transactional and it's more instrumental.
Right.
I think it's about, my friend Ron Buckland says I think it's quite good that prose is about communication, poetry is about communion.
Oh,
I'll
that's a
buy
lovely way
that.
of putting it.
I think poetry and song are essentially shamanistic. In saying in the words or singing the words, I alter my state of consciousness, which hopefully this is what shamanism is, alters your state of consciousness. Whereas when I'm writing prose, I'm very aware that I'm not even with that person who's going to be reading it.
Yeah.
They're sitting by themselves reading it, and I want them to get it.
Yeah, well, I think
But
that's
it's not
right.
shamanistic.
One is open to numerous or almost endless interpretations depending on how the person wishes to do it. Whereas you're informing the reader in prose, you're saying, this is what I want you to know.
Essentially, yes, this one. Yeah, you're selecting the story, and people will still react differently to
Of
it.
course.
But it is much less subjective, and much more from a writer's point of view, instrumental. You think, oh, I'm going to make them laugh here, or this will be. Oh, I think I need to take a break here, so that can slow down or that can sink in. I never think about the reader when I'm writing a poem. Writing a poem is like trying to tune a whole piano or 10 pianos to itself. You try and tune the words to themselves. Whereas when I'm writing prose, I'm partly having a good time myself, but above all, I'm very aware that someone is going to read this.
Right.
And that shapes, it's like talking with you. I mean, we have a conversation. It's a one-sided conversation, I admit. But you know what I mean? That
Yes.
It's not like me humming to myself.
Yeah.
I'm actually saying this to a purpose.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's that non-fiction book. I discovered I liked the work ethic. I liked it. I got paid for it. My readership was about 20 times that of poetry. And I discovered I could actually make a living because enough people bought the book for the publisher to pay me money.
Yeah.
And it's an honest transaction. You like the book, you give me money.
Yeah.
And we exchange. And that led to a second expedition on the unclimbed ridge of Everest. And by the time I'd written 2 whole prose books, I'd kind of got in the habit of sitting on my arse, 5 hours a day kind of thing. I discovered I liked it. So I was staying with my sisters in Italy before Christmas and found myself reading an old journal, or recent journal, and I'd noticed I'd slipped into the third person. And I thought, my life was really chaotic at the time, and I thought, this is quite a good story. I'd never ever thought of writing a novel before.
Yeah.
But I thought, it can't be that different. And I got into the habit, as I say, writing prose. So that's what made me become a novelist, was writing this, in some ways, quite autobiographical first novel. And by that time, I'd kind of got used to it. Okay, I guess I'm a writer. And it means I'm not dependent on the Scottish Arts Council. And I have a relationship with putative readers.
Yeah.
Which is lovely. My father could read these books. He said, I don't understand this modern poetry, son. But I knew he could read prose books.
So what was the first novel? What's the name of it?
That was Electric Bray.
Electric Bray.
Aye.
Right. And that is the kind of most autobiographical one you've done.
Yes. It's my life with bells on.
The one, the novel which I know best and absolutely love is Fair Helen.
Oh, that's nice. Great.
And it's a historical
that's
novel.
much further away from me, yes.
Yes.
It's not about me.
And it's based on a border ballad, Fair Helen of Connell Lee.
See, that comes direct from the song.
Yes. Well, this is
The
interesting.
novel wouldn't exist without the song.
It's set down in Annandale, and my mother's side of the family are from there. And I was saying, I'm reading this novel called Fair Helen, and immediately she came out with, Fair Helen. I knew the song. She knew the song. Yeah.
I can sing a little bit of Archie Fisher's version of it if you want.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Yeah.
The best recording I've ever come across of it is, there's lots of different tunes to it. It's Archie Fisher's. So I finally met him. He was something of a hero of mine. I met him in the course of doing that book.
Oh, fantastic.
And the track had long disappeared, but he actually gave me one of his last copies of Man with a Rhyme, I think it's called. The album's called. And on it is... It's not the kind of thing I can sing very well, but I quite often do this with Rachel Newton, a wonderful folk musician, singing it. And she does it with a class act, and it's just heartbreaking. Again I where Helen lies, for night and day on me And I am weary for the skies of fair Kilconnell Lee.
Fantastic.
And I love it. See, when Rachel does it, and then she would set that up, she'd maybe do 2 verses and then just drop out to playing just the clausi, and then I'd come in with the talking bit from the book. And that's really great fun too, because you got the original song, about 500 years old, which told a true story, and then you got the novel version of it being read out over it.
Yeah.
But the novel version is set at that exact period. And starts in Hawthornden Castle, and the narrator has got this song in his head, because these songs were published in broadsheet ballads forms within very short time of the events happening. It's a bit like the Wild West, which was similarly mythologised even as it was happening. So the Border Reivers mythologised themselves while they were still at it.
What I was interested in is this is a period that I only started to know when I studied Scottish literature at university, and you had, Hugh McDermott saying not Burns Dunbar, and all these stories that most people hadn't yet discovered. Was that just because this period interested you, or did you want to kind of say there is more here that people should know about? What was the reason for the setting and the place?
I'd always been haunted by that ballad, The Twa Corbies. You probably did it at school, most Scots school kids did. We had a very good English teacher, always boils down to that. A guy called Alistair Mackey, who was a very fine poet in Doric Scotch.
Right.
Very highly strung man who didn't like teaching. He was much too sensitive for it. But anyway, he really plugged the border ballads with us. He loved them, and he had the voice for it. And in particular, the Twa Corbies, and I remember doing it in English. And then my friend George and I, as Fate and Ferret, did it at a Burns supper, with wild yowling and violins, fiddle playing, and 2 droning guitars tuned down in a really kind of very vague and far out way. And it always haunted me, that thing. So what happened was, about 30 years later, I wrote a novel called, Skin, something to do with skin in it, When They Lay Bare. It's a slight misquotation from a line of the thing. Or his white banes when they lie bare, the winds shall blow forevermore. So the book was called When They Lay Bare, and it was haunted by the real incident and by that ballad, the incident that lay behind it. Though it's largely set now, but because it's so affected by the past, there's somebody in it who may or may not be an avenging ghost, or else it's just psychotic. It's very hard to say. For a long time I didn't know myself which she was, but she's certainly come with a mission. And the more I read into the Border Reivers, the more fantastically interesting they were. At that time I was living in Peebles.
Right.
So, because like a lot of Scots, I don't really know the Borders well. I know the Highlands pretty well. I know Central Scotland pretty well. The Borders was more or less a closed book to me. Yeah. But now I was living in it and thinking about it and reading about it and walking in it. It really started to get to me, and I thought these... And also the English borders, because the borderlands were the borderlands.
Yeah.
And they didn't particularly think in terms of Scottish or English. Yeah. They were borderers. And Northumberland, where my grandparents were from, I knew it reasonably well. And I always thought it was a very beautiful landscape, because it's very bare. In fact, it's much more bare than Scottish borders, which are actually quite fertile.
They're quite lush,
and very productive.
Absolutely.
It's quite odd. It's kind of, it's not, you always automatically assume that the Scottish version is much harder and more austere, but it's not.
No.
It's the other way around. And I love the English side of the borders. So anyway, that's what led to me reading a lot about it and writing a book which uses on the imagery and the tropes, fate, superstition, the supernatural, stuff I don't believe in, but my God, it's powerful.
Yeah, absolutely.
And murder and passion and revenge. I mean, it's all the stuff I don't believe in, but my God, it's in the bone. It really is right in our Scottish bones.
I think you're right. That whole area, we were talking about this just recently, particularly since you build a motorway going up one side of it and then a motorway across the top of it, kind of got forgotten. And this the wonderful history of it and it's still there, and it's in the buildings and the statues and the songs and discovering the work of Hogg and it was just amazing.
Late discovery for me. Stevenson writes somewhere that the great contribution of Scotland to world literature was the Border Ballads, and I think he probably is right. He was right about a lot of things. So what happened was, about 3 books later, there's a friend of mine, John Wallace, who lives in Kirtlebridge, which is right next to Kilconnell, and he wrote and said I was thinking about you the other day. I think you might be interested in this ballad, which I'd never heard of, frankly. And this is where I live and it's where I'm born, and why don't you come over and I'll show you the graves and I'll show you the kirk and I'll show you the woods where the shot was fired from. And I thought, okay, nothing better to do, so I went over to see him, and we walked around the place for a couple of days, and it just fascinated me because, like most of the Border Ballads, it's based essentially on an historical event, however mythified and distorted over periods of time. And you can look at those graves, you can stand in that rain, and then you get that sunshine, you shelter under bridges. The burn is the same burn.
Yeah.
The crypt is the crypt. And all these family names, you can go to these peel towers, the ruined towers, most of them are ruined, not all of them, and the same families are connected to them. I mean, Borders is like that.
Yeah.
And all 3 families was still there. And it was just uncanny. And I was driving home thinking, it's often called the Scottish Romeo and Juliet. And I thought, well, I've kind of done my Romeo and Juliet books. But I was thinking about, I've been reading a book called Shakespeare, 1599, a year in the life of, when he's just about to write Hamlet. And I was thinking I would always wanted to write a novel, the point of view of a sidekick.
Ah, yeah.
Very fertile position, like Horatio, I was thinking idly. And then into my head has jumped in his name, Harry Langton. And I thought, oh yes, Harry Langton is from Leith. His father's a cooper. He would have gone to Edinburgh University, paid for by the Guild, which is how he could have met someone of the gentry, Adam Fleming, who's part, and that takes him into the love triangle, which will end very badly. And by the time I got home, the whole thing kind of more or less shaped up in my head. And I knew Hawthornden Castle, because I'd been on a writing retreat there. And I thought, that's where it's set. Harry is writing this 40 years later in the very cold room, because I knew the cold rooms in Hawthornden Castle. And that's how the book opens. And I sat down and wrote this opening, and I had a voice in my head, and it wasn't my voice, it was a Scots voice seasoned with little bits of Latin and little bits of French, quite like my father's, Doric, and little bits of Lallands.
The language is incredibly rich, and it's got an index in it. I love doing
it. There's a small index in the back. I mean, I usually try and use words in a context so you can make a good guess at what it would have to mean, particularly for English readers, but even Scots readers. Some of those words would be familiar.
Yeah.
Other ones are not. And I just put them there because they just seemed right. But I also tried to put it in a context where you can understand it.
Sure.
And just in case, there's about 2-3 page index at the back.
Yeah, there's some fantastic words, which, as you say, I heard my grandparents maybe use, or there's a real historical language there which comes through, which I think had got lost. I think, particularly from the Borders.
Yes, particularly from the Borders stuff. Curious enough, the Doric seems to have survived more than a lot of the. And my father, in affectionate mood, would use these wonderful words. I remember he used to say, "I'm wabbit, I'm mair than wabbit, I'm fair disjesket." Disjesket. I remember, mair than wabbit, disjesket. Forfochen was another one. It sounds like swearing, it's not. Forfochen. Completely fucked, basically.
Yeah.
It's great. So I found myself, hearing that in Harry Langton's voice. And the great thing is the ballad gave you the bare bones of a story, and you just had to work out the rest. What was really going on here? What did happen? What's the story behind the story? And I found just by going around back down there and walking the place and finding lonely inns and places to shelter and places to hide and unexpected paths and a lost cave, that they just found themselves into the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What I remember best was my friend John Wallace was standing on top of a peel tower, which are these defensive and signalling towers that they had. And it was quite a clear day, it was a bit misty, and he said, those hills in that mist there, those are English hills, and a troop of horsemen could be there in an hour. And, you know, they could just raise this place like that. They can burn it, they can kill you, they can kidnap you, they can take all your cattle and sheep. These are what these people lived with.
Yeah.
And that's just over there.
Yeah.
What's the one? It's got to get around the Solway mosses, and they're here. And similarly, the Scots could and weather there in an hour. And I thought, blimey, no wonder these people were a bit edgy and a bit paranoid, and kept their armour and their swords, you know, by the door.
Yeah.
Because they could saddle up and be prepared to go to Reeve in about an hour, they reckon.
And the use, I suppose, of supernatural and ghost stories and anything that might stop, you know, people going into certain areas would probably...
Well, I hadn't thought of that. But they certainly bought into non-Christian ideas of supernatural and fate and the inevitable and ghosties.
Yeah, exactly.
Bogles.
Yeah. So... I think you mentioned earlier on that you're going to be doing some more music. Is that the plan?
Yes, I'm thinking of doing a CD of these songs. I've got about 12 songs that I feel stand up over. I mean, I must have written, 40 or 50 over the years, but most of them, they wouldn't stand up. But I would like to do about 10 to 12 songs that some of which I keep, play one or two in public.
Sure.
One of them is on this CD, the song for Mal, so I can't do that one again. But with pals that I have who are proper musicians, people like Mike Vass and Fiona Hunter, and Alan Toll is a wonderful musician. It would be just so much fun to bring those people together. And we've already got a project with my friend George Boyce from Fate and Ferret, and Brian Michie, and myself and Johnny Miles, who was at school with us as well, to kind of do it's like a pre-fence collective.
Yeah.
That's what we were into 30 years earlier, but we didn't have the technology that allowed us to record quality albums in our bedrooms. I mean, I love what the Fence Collective do, very good, and it's because it chimes so much with what we were trying to do. We had our immediate circle, and we had new friends, and we would drag people into, we need a flute for this. Who plays the flute in the school? Oh, Kathy plays the flute, right? Come on, Kathy, can you record this for this gig with us? And so it was a kind of wonderful return to kind of go back to the pals that you made music with in 1968, 69. Yeah. But doing the songs we've written in the interim, because all of us kept writing and kept playing. Yeah. So I think that's two CDs I'd like to make. One of them is essentially my own stuff, performed with other people, and the other one would be this. I don't know what you call it, the East Nuke, the pre-fence before the fence, before the fence existed. So. Dykes, something like that. So that's what. It's
a really lovely story, actually. The idea of the group of friends who desire was to make music, coming back through different connections all these years later and making that music.
That's something so satisfying. That
Absolutely.
Circle. Will the circle be unbroken? Yeah.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for talking to me today. It's been a real pleasure.
I enjoyed havering. I hope I haven't havered too much.
Oh, absolutely not. And we'll be back soon with someone completely different. Cheers. And that was our Andrew Greig podcast. Just a fascinating man to listen to about music and poetry and all these things that he's interested to. The passion, the just is undeniable. And I want to thank him again for giving up his time to talk to us. We'll be back soon, as I said, with something completely different. Genuinely don't know who it's going to be, but they'll have to go a fair bit to be as entertaining as that. But we will see you then. Cheers.